Hello Year 10, Miss Apps here. Firstly, I'm going to apologise. I cannot go live with you simply because my flat is far too noisy and the P33 trundles past and you just won't be able to hear me at all. So I'm actually recording in between buses going past my house when it's really quiet. We're going to start over the coming weeks on our Elizabeth content. Now, the reason we're going to do that is because it's really, really important that we make sure that we can get a little bit ahead so that when we get back in year 11 or when we get back, whenever we get back, we've still got loads of time to revise before those really important exams next year. So what we're going to do over the coming weeks is I will be sending you 2 videos a week. In those videos, you'll be given tasks and we will use the internet, we'll use video clips, and we'll also use our online textbook to be able to get ahead with Elizabeth. So let's get started with what I think is the best period in English history. You know I love the Tudors. You might have noticed in that first slide my image of me being a massive nerd in the Tudor costume that I actually own, that my friend made me, who is a costume designer. So, what do you already know about the Tudors? Well, if you listened in year 7, you might remember that the Tudors were originally a minor family, a minor dynasty, who came to the throne after Henry VII's defeat of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, which ended the Wars of the Roses. You might also know, as everybody does, that Henry VIII, his son, was probably the origin of the distracted boyfriend meme, racking up not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, but 6 wives, the most amount of wives of any king in English history. You may also know, if you're a massive Tudor buff like me, that Henry VIII, alongside having 6 wives, had 2 of them beheaded. The first wife that he had beheaded was my favourite of the wives, Queen Amberlynn, who lost her head on tramped up, made up charges of adultery on May 19, 1536. If you're really, really clever and you really, really know your stuff, you may also know that it was Amberlynn who left behind a very ginger, very grisly toddler who would grow up to be Elizabeth I, one of the most famous queens in English history. If you're a really, 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 really massive nerd, you might also listen to the soundtrack to the musical 6, which is a pop, rock, hip-hop version of the wives of Henry VIII, but that is a whole nother story. Moving on to Elizabeth though, over the coming weeks, we are going to trace her absolutely amazing story. She's a fascinating figure because her life is so full of terrible downs and then massive ups. So, she started her life as a toddler. She lost her mother to the axe. She would be reduced from being a princess to being a royal bastard, receiving the name Lady Elizabeth instead of princess. From there, she would go through the terrible situation of being inappropriately abused by a stepfather. She would end up as a teenager in the Tower of London being questioned. And then finally, in the reign of her sister Mary I, she would face the reality of nearly having her head chopped off and then living her teenage years in her early 20s in a state of house arrest. She would finally come to the throne at the age of 25, and even she herself said it was miraculous that she'd even gotten to that stage. But across that reign, from the age of 25 through to nearly her 70s, she would live through an era-defining reign that would see her known in history as Gloriana. She would establish her own version of the English Protestant Church, and she would come to be known as the queen that then kick-started and sparked the English Empire, which would expand through the 18th and the 19th centuries. Now, we're not going to quite get that far, but we will trace the story of her reign looking at religion, at the social problems of the era, and looking at what it was like and the difficulties of being a female monarch in a time that was really patriarchal, in a time when women were not seen to be fit to rule. So we're going to get started with our first task now that the P33 has gone past. What I want you to do is Google the Tudor family tree. And from the images you come across, I want you to work out who Elizabeth's mother was. Kind of already told you that. Who her sister and her brother were. And in turn, I want to know who her sister and her brother's mothers were. That is a mouthful. Secondly, I want you to have a look at who Mary, Queen of Scots was. Now, the Tudors loved the name Mary, so it's going to get a little bit confusing to you. Henry VIII had a sister called Mary, and Elizabeth I's chief rival throughout her reign was another woman called Mary, who was not her sister, who was also called Mary. There were an awful lot of Marys, so can you work out who Mary, Queen of Scots was in relation to Liz? Finally, once you've done that, I want you to go to the website that you can see. So www.elizabethfirst.org/contents/family. And I want you to read the profiles on Henry VIII, Edward VI and Mary. And the main thing that I want you to do is, next to a type of Tudor family tree that you've created for yourself, I want you to note down the dates of the rise to the throne and the deaths of each of the Tudor monarchs. I want you to write down what their religious stance was, and I also want you to get down some of the impacts that they had on England. You're going to notice that Henry VIII, one of Henry VIII's main impacts, was an awful lot of debt for his children to pick up. All right, you best have paused that video. So, what should you have learned from your little Google session there? What you should have learned was that her father, Henry VIII, reigned from 1509, when he came to the throne at the age of 17, can you believe it? And would die in his 50s in 1547. You should have learnt that one of the chief impacts of Henry VIII on England was his establishment after the Henrician Reformation of the Church of England, over which he was the authority and not the Pope. And as a consequence of this, Henry VIII, actually being quite a good Catholic boy at heart really, created a system, a church, which, whilst it didn't have the Pope at its head, was still very much Catholic in its doctrine and in its practices. Therefore, as historians, when you get a bit more fancy, when you get towards A-level, when you get to university, we talk about Henry VIII's reign as being a period of Catholicism without the Pope. You should have learned about Edward VI. Now, Edward VI takes over in a real issue of debt as a result of his father's spending money on lots of wars with France and Scotland. Edward was also raised by his Protestant uncles and his Protestant relatives, who were the family of his own mother, Jane Seymour. During his reign, we saw real reform and England move towards true Protestantism, almost Puritanism. Then finally we move on to Mary I from 1553 to 1558. To Protestants, known as Bloody Mary, though I would argue she actually wasn't that bad, and we can have a long conversation about my thoughts about Mary at some point in the future. Mary, of course, was a Catholic, and she was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, and the only true royal princess that he ever married. And she established a counter-reformation where she brought Catholicism back in England. Now, lots of historians today would argue that actually the Catholicism under Mary was fairly popular, although in history, as a result of her sister Elizabeth taking over, the story of the 300 martyrs, the 300 people that she had burnt at the stake, have kind of tainted her reputation. Finally, you should have found out, if you were clever enough, that Mary, Queen of Scots was Elizabeth's cousin. Now, she was Elizabeth's cousin, descended from Henry VIII's least favourite sister, Margaret, who'd married off into the Scottish royal family. Mary, Queen of Scots herself was her grandchild, and she would grow up in France after Henry VIII had tried to kidnap her as a baby to get her married off to Edward. But that's another story for our A-level. The Tudors, to me, are amazing just because of the sheer amounts of family drama. And I want you to have a little bit more of a look at the drama of Elizabeth's life with our final task here. This should take you about 20 minutes. So what I want you to do is Google Elizabeth I childhood BBC Teach, or type in the URL that you can see on the screen. And you should come to a page that looks like the page in the image that you can see here. Now, this page is full of video clips and really, really good descriptions of the basics of Elizabeth I's biography, the basics of her life. So what I want you to do is use the page to create a timeline of Elizabeth's life from her birth in 1533 to her death in 1603. You could do this across a whole page in your book, or if you'd prefer, I myself would do it with each key date in the margin and my descriptions written in the lines as usual. You know what I'm like, I hate a timeline. Well done, boys. Stay safe, and remember to send any evidence of the work that you have completed today to your teacher. Also remember that you'll have not one but 2 video lessons to do a week, so make sure that you've also at some point this week clicked on the second